You know that feeling when you're trying so hard to be seen, but it's like you're invisible? That was my entire childhood. Sometimes I wonder if my parents even noticed I was there unless they needed someone to praise Mark in front of. Where are you watching from today? Comment down below. My earliest memory of realizing I was second best was my 8th birthday. Mom and Dad got me a set of colored pencils, the basic kind from the dollar store, while just a month earlier, they'd thrown Mark this elaborate dinosaur-themed party for turning 10, complete with custom decorations and a professional cake. I remember smiling and saying thank you because that's what good girls do, right? Even when their heart is breaking a little. It wasn't just birthdays. Mark would bring home a C+ on a math test, and my parents would celebrate by taking us all out for ice cream. They'd say, "He's really trying his best," beaming at him. Meanwhile, I'd be sitting there with my straight A report card that no one had even asked to see. As we got older, the pattern just became more obvious. When Mark joined the basketball team in high school but barely played, my parents never missed a game. They'd cheer from the bleachers like he was the star, even though he mostly warmed the bench. But when I won the regional science fair, my dad had a work thing, and my mom said she couldn't find parking, so she went home. It still stings when I think about it. Standing there with my blue ribbon, scanning the crowd for familiar faces, and finding none. My chemistry teacher ended up driving me home that night. She asked if my parents were sick or something, and I just shrugged because what could I say? No, they just don't care about my achievements? By sophomore year, I stopped telling them about my accomplishments altogether. What was the point? Instead, I channeled my energy into planning my escape. I started working at 16, first at the local grocery store, then picking up weekend shifts at a coffee shop. Every dollar I earned went straight into my freedom fund. My parents never questioned why I was working so much. I think they were just happy I wasn't asking them for money. Meanwhile, Mark got a brand new car for his 16th birthday, a car that he crashed 3 months later while joyriding with friends. Instead of making him face consequences, my parents replaced it with another one. Slightly used this time, but still. The summer before senior year was when everything came to a head with college applications. I had been researching scholarships obsessively, knowing my parents wouldn't contribute much. When I brought up college planning at dinner one night, my father looked up from his plate just long enough to say, "We've been saving for Mark's tuition since he was born. You've always been so independent, Sarah. We're sure you'll figure something out." Figure something out. As if my education was an afterthought, a problem I needed to solve on my own while they'd been planning for Mark's future for years. That night, I cried until I had no tears left. Not because I was sad, but because I was angry. I'd done everything right. Studied hard, stayed out of trouble, worked part-time jobs, and it still wasn't enough to be valued in my own family. When acceptance letters started arriving in the spring, I got into several good schools, including a partial academic scholarship to State University. My mother glanced at the scholarship letter and said, "That's nice, honey," before turning back to helping Mark with his applications. He'd failed to meet most deadlines, so they were scrambling to find somewhere, anywhere, that would still accept him. Mark eventually got accepted to Westfield, a private university known more for its parties than its academics. The tuition was astronomical, but my parents never hesitated. They emptied their savings, took out a second mortgage on the house, and even cashed in some retirement funds to make it happen. For Mark. Always for Mark. Meanwhile, I cobbled together my partial scholarship with student loans and planned to work throughout college to cover living expenses. No one offered to help. It was just expected that I would make it work because I was the responsible one. My freshman year at State was a blur of classes, study sessions, and shifts at the campus bookstore and local diner. I barely slept 4 hours a night. Sometimes I'd call home, hoping to hear a supportive voice. But conversations always circled back to Mark's college experience. The friends he was making, the parties he was attending, the college life he was enjoying while I was working myself to exhaustion. In my sophomore year, I switched my major to business with a focus on technology. I had always been fascinated by the way apps were changing how people connected and consumed services. While my classmates were out socializing, I was in the library, devouring books on entrepreneurship and taking extra coding classes online. It was during winter break that year when we got the call from Westfield. Mark had been placed on academic probation after failing most of his classes. Instead of holding him accountable, my parents blamed the school, the professors, the distractions of college life. Everything except Mark himself. By the end of his sophomore year, Mark had dropped out completely. 2 years of expensive private education down the drain. When he came home, my parents welcomed him with open arms and reassurances that college isn't for everyone, and he just needs to find his path. I came home that summer too, working 2 jobs to save for the upcoming semester. I'd watch as Mark slept until noon, played video games all day, and went out with friends at night, all while my parents continued to cook his meals, do his laundry, and give him spending money. Not once did they suggest he get a job or make a plan. One evening, after a particularly long shift, I overheard my mother on the phone with her sister. "We're just so worried about Mark," she said. "He's having such a hard time figuring out what he wants to do with his life." Sarah's fine, of course. She's always been fine on her own. Fine on my own. As if my success despite their neglect somehow justified that neglect. As if struggling and sacrificing without their support was just my natural state of being, not something that was crushing me slowly from the inside. I returned to college for my junior year with a renewed determination. I wasn't just going to be fine. I was going to be exceptional. And I wasn't doing it for their approval anymore. I was doing it for myself, and for the future I deserved, but would have to build with my own 2 hands. Little did I know that my real education was just beginning. Not in how to succeed, but in how to recognize when it's time to walk away from the people who will never see your worth, even when they share your blood. Graduation day should have been one of the happiest days of my life. I'd finished my business degree with honors, working 3 jobs throughout my senior year to make it happen. As I sat in my cap and gown, waiting for my name to be called, I scanned the audience. My parents had promised they'd come, but their seats were empty. I found out later they'd stayed home because Mark had a really bad hangover and needed looking after. That day crystallized everything for me. I was on my own, had always been on my own, and in a strange way, it was liberating. No more hoping for approval that would never come. No more disappointment when they inevitably chose Mark over me. I was free to chase my own dreams without the weight of their expectations, or, more accurately, their lack of expectations. During my final semester, I'd been developing an idea for an app that would revolutionize local delivery services. The concept was simple but powerful, connecting people who needed things delivered with a network of local couriers who could make those deliveries within hours, not days. In busy urban areas, people would pay a premium for that kind of convenience, and the platform would create flexible income opportunities for couriers. I spent weeks refining my business plan, running the numbers, researching the market, and creating flowcharts for how the app would work. I built a basic prototype using the coding skills I'd taught myself, staying up late into the night after finishing my shifts at the diner and the bookstore. The more I worked on it, the more convinced I became that this could really work, that I could build something meaningful. One weekend, about a month after graduation, I drove home to visit my parents. I hadn't seen them since my graduation no-show, but I wasn't there to rehash old hurts. I was there because, despite everything, they were still my family, and I wanted to give them a chance to be part of this new chapter in my life. I'd prepared a pitch deck, just like I would for any potential investor. I sat them down at the kitchen table and walked them through my business plan, the market research, the prototype. I explained how I needed $5,000 to secure server space, finalize the app development, and launch a small marketing campaign. It wasn't a handout. I'd drawn up paperwork offering them equity in return, making it a proper investment opportunity. I'll never forget the way they looked at each other when I finished speaking. My father chuckled first, then my mother joined in, both of them laughing like I'd just told them the funniest joke they'd ever heard. "Oh, Sarah," my mother said, wiping a tear from her eye. "This is sweet, but it's not realistic. Apps are made by big tech companies, not girls fresh out of college." "Your mother's right," my father added. "You need to get a real job with benefits, something stable. This startup nonsense is just a fantasy." I sat there, my carefully prepared presentations spread out before them, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. It wasn't even that they'd said no, it was the dismissiveness, the certainty that I would fail before I'd even begun. "It's only $5,000, I said quietly. "I've done all the research. The risk is minimal compared to the potential return." "We don't have that kind of money to throw away on experiments," my father said with finality. "We're still recovering financially from Mark's college expenses." I nodded, gathered my materials, and didn't argue further. What was the point? In their eyes, I would always be the responsible one who didn't need help, while Mark would always be the one who deserved every sacrifice they could make. The very next week, I called home to check in and heard the excitement in my mother's voice. Mark had announced he wanted to find himself by traveling abroad for a year. My parents had not only supported this idea, but had given him $20,000 from their home equity line to fund his journey of self-discovery. $20,000. 4 times what I had asked for to start a legitimate business. Given to Mark without hesitation, without equity paperwork, without even a solid plan for how he would spend it or what he hoped to achieve. That was the moment something hardened inside me. I realized that no matter what I did, no matter how practical or well thought out my plans were, I would never be the priority. So I stopped looking for their approval and decided to prove them wrong instead. I moved into the cheapest apartment I could find, a tiny studio with 3 roommates in a not great part of town. I kept my job at the diner but added night shifts at a 24-hour convenience store and weekend work doing data entry. My life became an endless cycle of work, sleep when I could get it, and developing my app. I cut every possible expense. I ate ramen and peanut butter sandwiches. I walked or took the bus everywhere to save on gas. I didn't buy new clothes or go out with friends or do anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Every spare dollar went into my startup fund. For a year, I lived like this. A full year of 80-hour work weeks, of collapsing into bed too exhausted to even dream, of waking up and doing it all over again. My roommates thought I was crazy. My few remaining friends stopped calling because I never had time to see them. But slowly, dollar by dollar, my fund grew. When I had saved $10,000, twice what I'd asked my parents for, I approached a small local business bank with my business plan. The loan officer was skeptical at first, but the thoroughness of my research and the working prototype convinced him to take a chance on me. The bank approved a small business loan that, combined with my savings, gave me enough to launch. I quit all but one of my jobs, the morning shift at the diner that would keep some money coming in while I built my company. I found affordable developers to help refine my prototype into a fully functioning app. I created a simple website and started approaching local businesses about being early partners on the platform. The first few months were terrifying. The app launched with bugs that needed fixing. Couriers were hesitant to sign up without guaranteed deliveries, and customers were reluctant to use the service without enough couriers. There were days I thought my parents had been right, that I was in over my head, that this whole thing would collapse and leave me with nothing but debt and humiliation. But then it happened. A popular local bakery signed on to offer same-day delivery of their goods through my app. Their loyal customers started using the service, which attracted more couriers, which made the service more reliable, which brought in more businesses. Slowly but surely, the flywheel began to turn. 6 months after launch, I was breaking even. At 8 months, I was making enough profit to quit the diner and focus on my company full-time. By the 1-year mark, I had a small office with 3 employees, hundreds of couriers on the platform, and partnerships with dozens of local businesses. I never called my parents to tell them, never sent them updates on my growing success. What would be the point? They had made it clear what they thought of my dreams, and now I was living them without their belief or support. I had proven them wrong, but the victory felt hollow because I'd had to achieve it entirely on my own. Still, I was proud of what I'd built. Not just a successful business, but a new life. One where my worth wasn't determined by how I compared to Mark, but by what I could achieve through my own determination and hard work. For the first time, I felt truly free. 3 years can change a lot of things. In 3 years, my company went from a struggling startup to a thriving business. We'd expanded to 5 cities, had a team of 20 full-time employees, and were featured in several regional business publications as a rising star in the tech industry. I'd moved from that cramped studio with roommates to a beautiful apartment of my own. I had finally started to feel like I'd made it. In those same 3 years, I'd maintained minimal contact with my family. A text on birthdays and holidays, the occasional brief phone call. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just busy building my own life, one that didn't revolve around seeking their approval or competing with Mark for attention that never came. Speaking of Mark, his finding himself trip had stretched from the planned 1 year to nearly 2. From what little my mother mentioned during our infrequent calls, he'd spent most of his time on beaches in Southeast Asia and at full moon parties, returning home only when the money ran out. No job prospects, no plans, just the expectation that he'd continue living in my parents' house indefinitely. I hadn't been back to my hometown in all that time, but when my mother called to invite me to Thanksgiving dinner, something made me say yes. Maybe it was nostalgia, or maybe some small part of me still hoped that my success would finally make them see me differently. The moment I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, I knew something was wrong. The yard was unkempt, the paint was peeling, and there was a "for sale" sign staked into the front lawn. My father answered the door looking older than I remembered, with new worry lines creasing his forehead. Inside, things were sparse. Many of the familiar decorations and furniture pieces were missing, replaced by empty spaces that echoed when we walked by. My mother hugged me tightly, too tightly, and Mark lounged on the couch, barely acknowledging my arrival with a nod before returning his attention to his phone. Dinner was a strained affair. My parents asked surface-level questions about my work, but didn't seem to really listen to the answers. Mark contributed nothing to the conversation except complaints about the food. It wasn't until dessert that my father cleared his throat and exchanged a meaningful look with my mother. "Sarah, we have something to discuss with you," he began, his voice unusually serious. "As you can see, we've put the house on the market." I nodded. "I noticed the sign. Are you downsizing now that it's just the 2 of you?" My mother gave a short, mirthless laugh. "It's not just the 2 of us. Mark is still at home." "Right," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "But he's an adult. Surely he'll be getting his own place soon." Mark snorted from across the table but didn't look up from his phone. "That's actually what we wanted to talk to you about," my father continued. "The truth is, we're in a bit of a financial situation. Mark's college, his time abroad, some investments that didn't pan out. Well, we've had to tap into our retirement funds. The house has 2 mortgages on it now, and we're struggling to keep up with the payments. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. I'm sorry to hear that. What are your plans? My mother reached over and patted my hand. That's why we wanted to talk to you, sweetheart. You've done so well for yourself with your little app thing. You have that big apartment now, and we thought maybe we could stay with you for a while, just until we get back on our feet. I stared at her, then at my father, then at Mark, who had finally looked up from his phone with a smirk on his face. They weren't just talking about my parents. They meant all three of them, my parents and my 28-year-old brother who had never held down a job for more than a few months. Let me get this straight, I said slowly. You want the three of you to move in with me? Just temporarily, my father rushed to add. 6 months, maybe a year at most. Just until we can sell the house and find something affordable. And what about Mark? I asked, looking directly at my brother now. What are his plans during this temporary arrangement? Mark shrugged. I've got some irons in the fire, some opportunities I'm exploring. The same vague non-answers he'd been giving for years. I turned back to my parents. So you've drained your savings and retirement funds supporting Mark? And now you expect me to house and support all three of you? After everything we've done for you? My mother said, her voice rising slightly. Is it too much to ask for you to help your family when we're in need? I almost laughed. Everything you've done for me? Mom, what exactly have you done for me? You didn't help with my college. You didn't support my business. You've barely even shown interest in my life. We raised you, my father said firmly. We put a roof over your head and food on the table. The bare minimum, I replied. And then you gave Mark everything else. The attention, the opportunities, the financial support. And now you want me to bail all of you out? We always knew you were the responsible one, my mother said, as if that explained everything. Mark just needs a little more help finding his way. Mark is almost 30, I said. He's had plenty of time and plenty of your help. How is moving in with me going to change anything? Mark finally spoke up. Don't act like you're so perfect, Sarah. Some of us don't have everything handed to us on a silver platter. I stared at him in disbelief. Handed to me? I worked 3 jobs to put myself through college. I built my business from nothing after you all laughed in my face when I asked for help. I have what I have because I earned it, not because anyone gave it to me. That's enough, my father interrupted. This is about families sticking together during tough times. Either you help your family or... He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Or what? I asked quietly. Or you're not the daughter we raised, my mother finished for him. Family comes first, Sarah. Always. In that moment, everything became perfectly clear. They had never seen me, the real me, with my dreams and struggles and accomplishments. They had only ever seen what I could do for them or for Mark. And now that I'd built something valuable, they wanted a piece of it. I stood up from the table, my dinner barely touched. I'm sorry, but I can't do this. I won't do this. I've spent my entire life being overlooked in favor of Mark, and I'm not going to spend the rest of it cleaning up his messes or yours. Sarah, my mother gasped, how can you be so selfish? It's not selfish to set boundaries, I said, surprised by how calm my voice was despite the storm of emotions inside me. It's not selfish to expect adults to take responsibility for their own choices. I love you all, but I won't enable this dysfunction anymore. My father's face hardened. Then maybe you should go, and don't bother coming back until you're ready to be part of this family. I looked around the table one last time, at my father's angry face, my mother's tearful one, and Mark's smug expression. This was my family, but they had never acted like it. They had never been there when I needed them, had never celebrated my victories or comforted me in my defeats. Why should I sacrifice everything I'd built to save them from consequences of their own making? Goodbye, I said simply, picking up my purse and walking toward the door. I heard my mother calling after me, but I didn't turn around. I got into my car, drove away from my childhood home, and didn't look back. That night, in my quiet apartment, I cried. Not because I regretted my decision, but because I was mourning the family I had always wanted, but never had. The parents who would have been proud of my accomplishments. The brother who would have been my friend and ally rather than a competitor for resources and attention. But amid the grief, there was also relief. No more pretending. No more hoping for approval that would never come. No more measuring my worth against their impossible standards. The next morning, I woke up and blocked their numbers on my phone. I removed them from my social media accounts. I instructed my assistant to screen all calls and visitors at my office. It was a clean break, painful but necessary. Then I threw myself back into my work with renewed vigor. My company wasn't just my livelihood anymore. It was proof that I had value, that I could build something meaningful without their support or approval. Every new city we expanded to, every new employee we hired, every positive review from customers felt like validation of my choice to walk away. In the quieter moments, I still wondered if I had done the right thing. Cutting ties with family, no matter how dysfunctional, is never an easy decision. But then I would remember the years of neglect, the constant favoritism, the expectation that I would sacrifice my future to clean up their messes. And I knew I had made the only choice I could live with. Family should lift you up, not drag you down. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for them, is to walk away and let people face the consequences of their own choices. 5 years is a long time to go without speaking to your family. 5 years of birthdays, holidays, and milestones celebrated with friends who had become my chosen family, instead of the people who shared my blood. 5 years of building something I could be proud of without seeking validation from those who had never given it freely. In those 5 years, my company had grown beyond anything I could have imagined when I was coding that first prototype in my tiny shared apartment. We'd expanded to 27 cities across the country. We'd secured serious venture capital funding. Our user base had grown to over 2 million active customers, and we'd created flexible income opportunities for thousands of couriers. I had been featured in Forbes' 30 Under 30 list. I'd been invited to speak at my alma mater about entrepreneurship and innovation. I'd bought a beautiful house in an upscale neighborhood, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I wanted a place that felt like home, a sanctuary I had created for myself. Through it all, I had maintained my boundaries. No contact with my parents or Mark. No checking their social media. No asking mutual acquaintances for updates. It was cleaner that way, less painful. I had grieved the family I never really had and moved forward with my life. Until the call came. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was in a meeting with my executive team when my assistant interrupted with an urgent message. My mother was on the phone, crying so hard she could barely speak. Under normal circumstances, I would have maintained my boundaries, but something in my assistant's voice told me this wasn't a normal circumstance. I excused myself from the meeting and took the call in my private office. "Sarah?" My mother's voice was thick with tears. "Sarah, I know you said not to call, but I didn't know who else to turn to." I remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "It's Mark," she said finally. He's not well. He's developed a substance abuse problem. We've tried to help him, but it's gotten worse. He needs professional treatment, the kind we can't afford." I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to hang up, to maintain the wall I'd built to protect myself. But another part, the part that still remembered what it was like to be part of a family, however dysfunctional, kept me on the line. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, my voice carefully neutral. but I don't understand what you expect me to do about it. We need help, Sarah, she said. Financial help. The house was foreclosed on 2 years ago. We're living in a small rental now, and we're behind on payments. Your father had to take early retirement because of his health, and my part-time job at the department store barely covers groceries. I thought about the $5,000 I had asked them for all those years ago, the money that could have launched my business sooner if they had believed in me enough to invest. I thought about the $20,000 they had given Mark without hesitation, money that had apparently been just the beginning of their financial ruin. What exactly are you asking for? I said finally. Money for Mark's rehab, she replied. And maybe a little extra to help us catch up on rent and medical bills. We've heard about your success, seen your name in the business news. We're so proud of you, Sarah. We always knew you would do well. The familiar bitterness welled up inside me. Did you? Because I remember you laughing at my business plan and telling me to get a real job. There was a pause on the other end of the line. We've made mistakes, my mother admitted, but we're still your family. After a long moment, I agreed to meet them for dinner at a neutral location, a restaurant in the city where I lived, which meant they would have to make the 2-hour drive to see me. I told myself I was just going to hear them out, not necessarily to help. I was curious, in a detached sort of way, to see what 5 years had done to them, just as I wondered if they would recognize what those same years had done to me. I arrived at the restaurant early, choosing a quiet corner table where we wouldn't be easily overheard. When they walked in, I almost didn't recognize them. My father had aged dramatically, his once robust frame now stooped and thin. My mother's hair had gone completely gray, and deep lines etched her face. And behind them, moving slowly and looking unwell, was Mark. I hadn't expected him to be there. My first instinct was to leave. This felt like an ambush, but I stood my ground as they approached the table. No hugs were exchanged, just awkward nods and murmured greetings as they took their seats. You look well, Sarah, my father said, his eyes taking in my tailored suit and the confidence with which I carried myself. Really well? Thank you, I replied. I am well. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table until my mother broke it with forced cheerfulness. We've been following your success in the news. That app of yours really took off, didn't it? We always knew you had such potential. I didn't bother to correct her revisionist history. Yes, the company has been successful. We're so proud of you, she continued, reaching across the table as if to take my hand, then withdrawing when I didn't reciprocate the gesture. Aren't we, Mark? Mark, who had been staring down at the table, looked up briefly. Yeah, congrats. His voice was flat, his eyes dull. He did look unwell, with a gauntness to his face that spoke of more than just aging. We ordered food that none of us seemed particularly interested in eating. My parents tried to maintain small talk, asking about my house, my work, my life in the city. I answered politely but without elaboration. The gulf between us felt too wide to bridge with pleasantries. Finally, after the plates had been cleared, my father leaned forward. Sarah, I'm sure your mother explained our situation on the phone. She mentioned Mark needs rehab, I said, and that you're having financial difficulties. It's more than difficulties, my father admitted. We're drowning. The medical bills, the rent, and Mark needs help. Professional help that costs money we don't have. How much are you asking for? I said, getting straight to the point. They exchanged glances. 50,000 would help us get back on our feet, my father said. Cover Mark's rehab, catch up on bills, maybe put a small down payment on a modest house. $50,000. 10 times what I had asked them for to start my business. I looked at each of their faces. My father's desperate, my mother's hopeful, Mark's resigned. I'll pay for Mark's rehab, I said finally. Directly to the facility, not to you. I'll research reputable programs and make the arrangements. Relief flooded my mother's face. And the rest? We really need help with the bills, Sarah. We're facing eviction. No, I said firmly. I'll help Mark get treatment because addiction is a disease and he deserves a chance to recover. But I won't fund your lifestyle or enable the same patterns that got us all here in the first place. My father's expression darkened. So you'll help him, but not us. After everything we've done for you? That's exactly the problem, I replied calmly. You still think you did something for me. You still can't see that you gave Mark everything and expected me to fend for myself. And now that I've done exactly that, succeeded on my own, you want to benefit from the success you played no part in creating. You ungrateful, my father began, but my mother cut him off with a hand on his arm. Please, Sarah, she begged. We need cash, not just a paid rehab bill. We can't even afford to keep our apartment while Mark is in treatment. I shook my head. My offer stands. Treatment for Mark, paid directly to the facility. Nothing more. My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Come on, he said to my mother. She clearly cares more about her money than her family. That's rich coming from the man who laughed in my face when I asked for a fraction of what you gave Mark, I said, still maintaining my composure. I'm not refusing to help. I'm refusing to enable. There's a difference. You always thought you were better than us, Mark muttered, the first full sentence he'd spoken all evening. Little Miss Perfect with her fancy company and big house. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time that night. I never thought I was better than you, Mark. I just wanted the same support and encouragement you received automatically. When I didn't get it, I had to find it elsewhere, in myself. They left in anger, my mother in tears, my father muttering about ingratitude, Mark trailing behind them like a shadow. I paid the bill and sat alone at the table for a long time afterward, processing what had just happened. True to my word, I researched rehabilitation facilities and found one with an excellent success rate. I paid for a 6-month program for Mark, all expenses covered. I sent my parents the details via email, with the admission date and location. I never found out if Mark actually went. The next week, I discovered they had launched a social media campaign against me. Vague posts about a daughter who had forgotten where she came from and turned her back on family. Extended relatives I barely knew sent me messages ranging from concerned to outright hostile. A cousin shared that my mother claimed I had stolen Mark's business idea and built my fortune on his creativity. It was absurd, of course. Anyone who knew me, who had seen my journey from college student to entrepreneur, knew the truth. But it still hurt to be painted as the villain in their story. Instead of engaging with their narrative, I channeled my energy into something positive. I established a scholarship fund for young entrepreneurs from unsupportive backgrounds. Students with drive and ideas, but without the family resources or connections to make them happen. Each year, the fund would provide not just financial support, but mentorship and networking opportunities to 5 promising students. And when the first cohort of scholarship recipients graduated and launched their own ventures, I felt a sense of pride and purpose that went beyond any business success I'd achieved. I was helping to break the cycle, to ensure that other young people with dreams wouldn't have to face the same obstacles I had. Family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who sees your worth, who supports your dreams, who stands by you through failures and celebrates your successes. I had found that family in my friends, my colleagues, and now in the young entrepreneurs I mentored. My success isn't measured by who returned when I had something to offer, but by who I can help succeed when no one believes in them. That's the legacy I choose to build. One of empowerment, not enablement. And in that choice, I finally found peace.